This presentation is going to cover imperialism in India. Your textbook may refer to it more as South Asia, in which we're talking about generally this region here. Again, South Asia is usually in this region. Southeast Asia usually includes this portion of the world. China being East Asia here with Korea and Japan. Again, when we talk about South Asia, we're talking about this region. It can be dangerous to call it India because India is a modern nation state and doesn't necessarily, in our minds, include Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. So be careful when you use the word India and make sure you are referring to, as we are in this case, the Indian subcontinent in this region. In this first part, we're going to talk about India and the British Empire. India is often referred to as the jewel in the British crown. What we mean by jewel in the British crown is that India becomes a very important economic and nationalist place to have imperialized. The first real British group to enter India would actually be a privately held company called the British East India Company. Again, that's the British East India Company. The East India Company had its own military divided into European and Indian divisions, held the right to collect taxes on land from Indian peasants, held legal monopolies over trade in all goods, constituted a military and repressive government, and finally offered economic privileges to those who allied themselves with the British against others. Again, A had its own military, divided into British and Indian divisions. B held the right to collect taxes on land from Indian peasants. The right to collect taxes on land from Indian peasants. So we can see with this one that it's essentially taking on the role and functions of a government. Part C. It held monopolies in the trade of all goods. And remember, and this will be important later when we discuss China, that opium was the most lucrative. So Part D summarizes kind of what we talked about in B there. But D states it constituted a military and repressive government. And knowing that many of my sophomores needed help with some of the vocab on a test using the word oppressive, I added here at the bottom a definition from the Google search of repressive. Finally, Part E, the British East India Company offered economic privileges to those who allied themselves with the British against others. This includes conflicts within India between different princes of different areas and regions. Again, they offered economic privileges to those who allied themselves with the British. So we're talking about the British policy was divided into two main camps. Those who wanted to westernize India, so those who wanted to westernize India, and B, those who thought it was safer and more practical to defer to local culture. In the first group, what we're talking about is bringing Christianity and infrastructure. And by infrastructure, we mean basically the benefits, so to speak, of the Industrial Revolution, bringing an educational system, bringing railroads and other utilities into India. Those who thought it was safer, more practical to defer to a local culture were more interested in an indirect type of control. Those of you who have had my class in the past and watched the video from the British Broadcasting Corporation, The Story of India has multiple episodes, but I assigned some for ninth graders that talked a little bit about this idea here and coming in conflict here. Much of it was often basically a form of racism. I want to include here a couple different maps. Again, these are from varied sources, but are open for non-commercial reuse. We're talking about here, if you can zoom in, the red is going to indicate British, the yellow is Hindu, and the green is Muhammadan, as it says here on the map, but that shows us that it's an old map because now Muhammadan is best referred to as Islam or Muslim areas. So we can see that the British in the very early 1765 controlled areas here on the East Coast and in what we now call Bangladesh. By 1805, so a mere 40 years later, we see they still control here. They've moved up the Ganges along the base of the Himalaya mountains, and they've spread out along the East Coast and a bit onto this West Coast. If you weren't sure, trade routes generally ran around through here. And so you can see this became a major port. They would move on and kind of hop the coast out towards Southeast Asia and Indonesia. This next map are the political divisions of the Indian Empire. This is much later and definitely closer to the time of the British Raj, which is what they refer to when the British government controlled India. On the map, we can see that red or pink, orange color here, this is the territory directly ruled over by the British government. The pink regions on the map are areas indirectly controlled by the British, i.e., as we saw in the earlier slide, where they rewarded allies. And then finally, the yellow areas are independently controlled areas, but obviously given the location of the yellow as surrounded by the British with the superior industrialized weaponry, probably had to basically do whatever the British wanted them to. The next major topic we need to discuss is the Sepoy Mutiny. This often goes by a multitude of different names. The Indians often refer to it as the First War of Independence. Sometimes it's referred to as the Great Mutiny of 1857. sometimes the Sepoy Mutiny, the Sepoy Rebellion, etc., and so forth. But for our purposes and our regular textbook, World History Patterns of Interaction, refer to it as the Sepoy Mutiny, and they date it as 1857 to 1858. Please keep in mind the roots of this run far deeper than a one-year conflict. Part 1. The uprising began near Delhi. So the official uprising began near Delhi, up here in the northern part, close to the Himalayas. You'll notice all these other underlined city names, and those are areas that were very important to the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoy Mutiny was mostly concerned with social, political, and economic grievances. During the mutiny, many Indian peasants attacked law courts and burned tax rolls. So again, many peasants attacked law courts and burned the tax rolls or the tax records. Part 4. It was a protest against debt and corruption. Not just necessarily against British officials, but also Native Indians who were complicit in the government. One of the parts that's also important is many Hindu and Muslim leaders denounced the Christian missionaries. This is especially important because there was many Jesuit missionaries in the area. The issues basically revolved around some religious issues. For the most part, what it really kind of boils down to, according to your textbook, is that the British were rumored to have used beef and pork fat in order to grease some of the equipment, the firearm equipment of the soldiers, many of whom were Indian, especially the foot soldiers. That's what the word sepoy means. Sepoy is related to the idea of a foot soldier. And if you didn't understand before, Islam is against the use of pork, and Hinduism is against the use of beef or cow meat. And so using the fat of those would be obviously very offensive. Part 6, we will discuss the British response. The British had a systematic campaign of repression. The political cartoon to the left came from British newspapers at the time, and you can see that it is quite striking. As part of that campaign, rebel towns and villages were destroyed. Towns and villages were destroyed. And then C, the defeat of the rebellion fired the imagination of the British public. The defeat of the rebellion fired the imaginations of the British public. And as a side note, that should probably be singular because public is one group. The next step will be reorganizing the Indian Empire after the mutiny. Again, that's reorganizing the Indian Empire after the mutiny. Step one, the British create new strategies to rule. Again, if you've seen, or I'll post some links to the BBC series about the story of India, some great videos here to back this up. 2, the British East India Company was abolished. 3, the British Raj ruled directly. Raj is a word that basically means monarch. And in this case, in 1858, Queen Victoria assumes control. And again, we mean she assumes control and abolishes the British East India Company, creating a British government over India. There was in part 4 here, the military is reorganized. Part 5, Queen Victoria is officially named Empress of India. And 6, they reform the civil service. And by that we mean the government, bureaucracy. 7, missionary activity is subdued, i.e. limited or held in check. And for a summary of India and Britain, India was Britain's largest market. And this will certainly play a role for us in the contemporary world. As India gains a larger middle class. India provided Britain with highly trained engineers and bureaucrats. Three, 1.2 million troops. fought for Britain in World War I. One of the goals of indirect rule was to create an Indian elite sympathetic at one end, or even to serve British interests at the other. The backfire here, kind of, like for the British, was some of these guys will become the backbone of the Indian nationalist movement.